What do you want to be when you grow up? It's a question that we're asked throughout our lives. As children, we might get somewhat silly or maybe some unrealistic answers. I actually asked my mom, I'm like, hey, I don't remember too much when I was growing up, but what were some things that I wanted to be? And bless her heart, they just got back. They drove all the way out here for my grandparents' anniversary. They just drove the 40 hours back, and she found the time after a long, exhausting journey to get some pictures together. So like most young boys, I looked up to our public servants, to the heroes of our city. So when I had the opportunity to meet with the Calgary Police, I figured that, maybe I could be a policeman. But we also have some firemen in our congregation, and they're big, strong, and tough. And I thought maybe I could be a fireman. And that is my sister in that picture, so she's not here, so I can show that now. Or I loved trains. We had a train that went right through our town. I heard it every single day, every single night. We'd be stopped at the crossings, and we'd count the cars, and there was one train that was 110 cars long. It took forever. But I thought maybe I could be a train conductor. I even got the fancy little hat. Others, oops, got to find it here, is I looked up to the men in my life. So I figured that, like my grandpa, who instilled in me a love for John Deere tractors, I could be a farmer. Or like my dad and other grandfather who like to work with their hands and build stuff and fix stuff, well, I thought I could help them out as well. It's the next one. There we go. That's us putting up our fence. But I also like to do stuff for fun. I love to play sports, and I'm not very good now, but when I was young, I thought maybe I could be a soccer superstar. And as my current mode of transportation might tell you, I've always loved driving fast cars. But as we get older, the question becomes a little more insistent. You guys just saw all the students that we had up here. Some in kindergarten, some in elementary, some in high school. And we start asking, especially as graduation approaches, what do you want to do? What do you want to be? What school are you going to go to? What program are you going to take? What are you going to do with your life? And some of our students might be feeling that pressure. They might be a little unsure. And I just want to tell you guys, that's fine. And for you kids who have these dreams, don't lose those. Follow those, pursue those. Maybe that is what God has for you. Maybe that's a passion He's given you. Who knows what God can do? But wouldn't it be a lot easier if someone literally sat you down and told you exactly who you were going to be when you grew up? And that is exactly what happened to a young man named David. Samuel the prophet shows up at his house with a horn full of slimy, icky oil, dumps it over his head, and says, "You, David, are going to be the next king of Israel." So I guess now's a good time to tell you we are starting a new series on the life of this man, David. And as we start this series, I guess we should learn a little more about him. So here are some fast facts on David. For one, we hear about him a lot. His name occurs more than 1,000 times in the Old and New Testaments. Not only do we hear about him a lot, we get to hear a lot of his story because more pages in the Bible are spent telling David's story than any other single person except for Jesus, of course. And if Jesus didn't have 4 Gospels telling his story, David would probably take the number 1 spot. But not only is David featured in the biblical story, he actually contributed to the Bible itself. He wrote about half of the book of Psalms. About 70 Psalms are attributed to David. David was a man of many talents. He was a shepherd, as we'll see today, a warrior, even from a young age, a poet, a musician, and more than all that, he was Israel's greatest king, except for Jesus. And because we see so much of David's story, we see all sides of him. We see both the good and the bad, his successes, his failures. So he feels like someone that we can relate to, someone we might know, someone who could be a friend. Or maybe we see ourselves in him. I know I sure do. I just wish it was less of the bad and more of the good. But today, in David's life, he is not a king. He's not a warrior. He's just a simple shepherd out tending his father's flocks. When his father comes and sends him on an errand to deliver his supplies to his brothers who are fighting the Philistine army. But before we get there, I should probably tell you that this is no ordinary battlefield. I'm sure many of you are familiar with C.S. Lewis's children's series, The Chronicles of Narnia. My mother actually read them to us as kids. And the most famous book, and it's been made into a movie, is, of course, The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe. But the second most famous is probably its sequel, Prince Caspian. And in Prince Caspian, again, I won't spoil too much of it if you haven't read it or seen the movie, I'd encourage you to. But the Narnians, the good guys, are in a battle with the Telmarines. And the Narnians don't have enough men to just go attack and beat the Telmarines. And the Telmarines don't really want to go and chase after the Narnians, so they're in this gridlock. But they still want to get the battle decided. So High King Peter has a brilliant idea that he is going to challenge King Miraz to a duel, to single combat, 1v1, and whoever wins not just the duel, but the whole battle, and the other side will surrender. Well, of course, it doesn't end up quite going like that, but I won't spoil the story for you. But the battlefield we find ourselves on today, and that David comes to, is like that. We have the Israelite army and the Philistines lined up against each other. Neither are willing to charge the enemy lines. They're just standing there until one man steps out from the Philistine lines. Our story this morning is found in the book of 1 Samuel, chapter 17. If you're using a print Bible, and I encourage you to turn with me there, it's about 1/4 or a little bit less of the way through the biblical text. Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1 Samuel. If you're joining us online or using a Bible app, it's just a couple clicks away. 1 Samuel chapter 17. And it's a very long chapter, so don't worry, we're not going to read all 58 verses, but we are going to see little snippets, and we might hop around a little bit, but I'm sure you'll get most of the story. We're going to pick it up in verse 4 and see who this man is. A champion named Goliath, who was from Gath, came out of the Philistine camp. His height was 6 cubits and a span. He had a bronze helmet on his head and wore a coat of scale armor of bronze weighing 5,000 shekels. On his legs he wore bronze greaves, and a bronze javelin was slung on his back. His spear shaft was like a weaver's rod, and its iron point weighed 600 shekels. This guy seems unbeatable. Who could hope to face this guy in battle? But not only is he coming out, he has a message for the Israelites. Verse 8, Goliath stood and shouted to the ranks of Israel, "Why do you come out and line up for battle? Am I not a Philistine? And are you not the servants of Saul? Choose a man and have him come down to me. If he is able to fight and kill me, we will become your subjects. But if I overcome him and kill him, you will become our subjects and serve us." Then the Philistine said, "This day I defy the armies of Israel. Give me a man, and let us fight each other." On hearing the Philistines' words, Saul and all the Israelites were dismayed and terrified. So we have this man who is presented as the champion of the Philistines. So the question we are left with is, if Goliath is the Philistines' champion, then who is Israel's? Who is going to fight for Israel? And I don't know about you, but as I've gone about my day-to-day life, I've seen a lot of signs that look a little bit like the one that will appear behind me. They say, "Help wanted." Anyone else seen those signs? Help wanted? Seems like everywhere. Grocery store, McDonald's. Everyone seems to be looking for someone to do a job. So, I imagined that there might be some of these posted at the Israelite camp. Help wanted. A champion to fight Goliath. And after reading Goliath's description, if we're going to have someone fight him, we need someone who matches up well against him. So we're looking for someone who's very tall, who's an experienced soldier, and has the proper equipment, the proper armor and weapons to get the job done. Now, we all understand that there's certain things that we have to meet the requirements for. I was talking to a child last week downstairs in our kids' time, and they were telling me all about their trip to Canada's Wonderland. And we went as young adults and youth earlier this summer, and of course, we were all about the biggest coasters, Leviathan, Behemoth. We wanted to ride those as much as we could. So I asked this child, "Hey, did you get to go on any of the big roller coasters?" And they said, "Nah, I'm not quite tall enough to ride the big ones yet." I'm like, "Okay, fair enough, you're not quite there. Well, what about the smaller ones, the ones you were tall enough? Did you go on those ones?" And their response fascinated me, because they said, "Well, there were some roller coasters that I was tall enough to go on, but I didn't feel ready. I didn't feel experienced enough to go on these. I want to work my way up from the smaller ones to the bigger ones." So we understand that to do certain things in life, you have to meet certain requirements. So we're going to look for a champion who can face Goliath, a person who is tall, who's an experienced soldier, and who has all the gear needed to face the Philistines' champion. So we're going to look at a couple candidates. And as David arrives at the Philistine camp, or not the Philistine camp, the Israelite camp, he drops off all the supplies, and he comes face to face with his brother, Eliab. And Eliab is not at all happy to see David, especially when he finds out what David is asking about. You see, David had come to the Israelite camp just in time to see Goliath come out and make his challenge to the Israelites. So he asked the obvious question, who is going to fight Goliath? And Eliab has some not so kind words for David. This is verse 28. When Eliab, David's oldest brother, heard him, David, speaking with the men, he burned with anger at him and asked, "Why have you come down here? And with whom did you leave those few sheep in the wilderness? I know how conceited you are and how wicked your heart is. You came down only to watch the battle." But let's look at Eliab for a second and see maybe he would be a good candidate to fight Goliath. You see, when we met Eliab, when the prophet Samuel came to David's house and they had all the brothers lined up, David came, and this is chapter 16, and he saw Eliab and he said, "Surely here stands the Lord's anointed." because he was tall. He was the firstborn. Surely this is the one that God is going to choose as king. But what God says to Samuel is very interesting. Again, just one chapter back in chapter 16. The Lord said to Samuel, "Do not consider his appearance or his height, for I have rejected him. The Lord does not look at the things people look at. People look at the outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart." So though Eliab was tall, an experienced soldier, and even if he didn't have the proper equipment, surely he could have gotten some from somewhere to fight Goliath. But the problem with Eliab was his heart. And the words he spoke to David were not actually true of David, but we do the same thing. When we criticize others, when we make judgments about their heart, what we say about their heart often reveals the condition of our own. You see, Eliab accused David of neglecting his responsibility, of not taking care of the sheep. It wasn't true. David had left them with someone to take care of them. But it was Eliab, in fact, who was neglecting his responsibility. As a soldier in Saul's army, after Goliath has made his challenge, it should be every soldier's response to want to go and fight, to represent his nation, his king, and his God. And with God on his side, surely he could defeat anyone the Philistines would choose as their champion. Eliab also accuses David of being conceited, of being proud, and having a wicked heart. But these things are true of Eliab. He is the one elevating himself over his brother. He is the one thinking only of himself. And Eliab also accuses David of just standing there and watching, not participating, not doing anything useful. But what had Eliab himself done for the past 40 days as Goliath has made his challenge? What we say about others' hearts often reveals the condition of our own. This is true of our brothers, our siblings, our parents, our children, the people we see on the street, strangers we don't even know. What we say about them often reveals more about us than it does them. So that's Eliab. He could fight Goliath, but chooses not to. Well, the next person we're going to encounter in our story is King Saul himself. He hears David asking about what's going to happen to Goliath. So he brings David before him. And here's what we know about Saul. We know that he, too, is tall. When Samuel is anointing and crowning him king, it describes Saul as head and shoulders above anyone else in all of Israel. We know that Saul is an experienced soldier. Right after he was crowned, he went and fought Nahash, the Ammonite, and rescued the city of Jabesh-Gilead. He has experienced God giving him victory in battle before. And he also has the proper equipment. We'll find out later as he tries to give it to David that he has the armor, he has the helmet, he has the sword, he has the shield, he has everything needed to go and be Israel's champion. But Saul refuses. Instead, he tries to pay other people to do what he should do himself. He offers a reward. He says, anyone who goes and fights and defeats Goliath, I'll give great wealth to. I'll make him my son-in-law. I'll have him married to my family. I'll give my daughter to him in marriage. And maybe the best part, him and his father's family don't have to pay any taxes. Wouldn't that be nice? But King Saul, even though he has all the resources, everything he needed, does not step up to the challenge. Instead, someone else does. Now, many of you might know I'm a huge Tolkien, J.R.R. Tolkien, Lord of the Rings fan. And I'm really enjoying the new series that's just come out on Amazon. So if anyone wants to watch that with me, let me know. It's good. It's good, Tom. Watch the first 2 episodes. Good stuff. But anyways, I want to talk not about that, but about the first book, The Fellowship of the Ring. And in that book, there's this council called, and there's kings and lords and princes, all these great and mighty people. And they're trying to decide what should be done with this ring, the one ring to rule them all, the ring of power that the enemy made. And they conclude that the only thing to be done, they can't use it themselves because it would corrupt them, so they must destroy it forever. They must cast it into the fire from whence it came, is the line. But they need someone to actually do that, to actually go and journey all the way there and get the job done. So amidst all these kings and princes and lords and even a wizard, none of them are willing to take up the challenge. Instead, a small voice of a hobbit, a halfling, the smallest and least important, the weakest person there, says, I will take it. I will take the ring. And that's the picture I'm imagining here. We were able to watch at Bud's place, we watched the screening of David, play by Sight and Sound Theater in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. And what I love about some of these adaptations, these plays, these movies, these TV shows like The Chosen, that tell us the Bible stories, is they give us a little broader picture of what might have been happening. In this play, in this scene, when David says he will fight Goliath, it's not just David and Saul alone off somewhere. The play showed, the play showed Jonathan, Saul's son, the prince. It showed Abner, the king's general, the leader of the army. And David's brothers were not far off either. And among all these great men, here's what David says in verse 32. David said to Saul, let no one lose heart on account of this Philistine. Your servant will go and fight him. See, David's proclamation, I'm sure, was convicting to Saul, because Saul eventually just let him go and fight despite his objections. But it shows a tendency that we ourselves can fall prey to. When I was doing my internship, one of the greatest things that I was able to do there was the opportunity to have the pastors who were there pour into me. We had some time with one of the pastors every single week, and they'd take a book, and we'd go through the book, we'd talk about the book, we'd talk about stuff not related to the book. They probably spent far more time than we deserved, hours each week, just talking with us, mentoring us. And the lead pastor, Derek, he took us through a book by Andy Stanley. It was originally called Choosing to Cheat. I think it's been renamed When Work and Family Collide. But what he was hoping to communicate to us in that book is that there are some things that we do that anyone can do. That, if someone else came and did that, they would do just fine. And what really impressed me about this pastor is he put his job as a pastor, not his calling, not the service, but he said, looking at it realistically, God could call me somewhere else. God could remove me from this position. Someone else could be the lead pastor at this church. And he had an attitude of, I don't need this. This isn't where I get my fulfillment, my identity. That's from Christ, but he's called me to serve, but he could call someone else in that role. And a lot of our jobs, the things that we do, volunteering, they fit in that category. Yes, it's important. Yes, they're good things, but someone else could do that. But he said there's other things, like being part of a family, like being a husband, being a brother, being a son, that only you can do, that God has given you that responsibility. So if you have to choose between giving time to your family, to the things that only you can do, or to work to things other people could do, choose your family every single time and cheat on your other responsibilities. But Saul, he was called Israel's king. He was supposed to represent them. He was supposed to trust in God and use his strength and his power. He was anointed as king and had the Lord's Spirit upon him. But even though he had all those things, he expected someone else to represent Israel and fight Goliath. And we do the same thing. We expect, enable, and even reward others for doing what we ourselves are called to do. Anyways, let's get to the action, the part we've all been waiting for, the battle scene. And anyone who's been in a proper fight knows that the real fight starts before any blows are exchanged. The real fight starts with the insults and threats given before the action. And since we do have our children with us present, I won't read them maybe word for word, but let's just say there's some doozies in there. When Goliath sees David, he has about the same opinion that Saul and Eliab have. Here's what Goliath says. He said to David, this is verse 43, "Am I a dog that you come at me with sticks?" And the Philistine cursed David by his gods. Goliath looks with the same eyes that Saul and Eliab. He sees David is small, inexperienced. The only gear he has is a shepherd's. But Goliath also made something very clear, something that I don't think anyone but David really grasped. That this battle is not just between the Philistine army and the Israelites. It's not just between the two champions. But the battle is actually between the gods, the Philistine gods, and the one true living God. And whoever wins this battle, then their champion must be, the one true God who is worthy of worship and praise. So we've looked at different candidates. We've looked at Eliab, and we've looked at Saul, and though they have the qualifications, they're willing to serve as Israel's champion. But what about David? Does he meet the qualifications? And I would say that he does, but not in the way that people expect. And here I would be remiss not to give credit to a guy named Abraham Curavilla. I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. He's a gentleman, a doctor, a scholar, a pastor, and a preacher. And it was through his articles and his explanation of this text that I got a lot of the ideas and the basic outline. So I actually sent him a note and said, "Hey, I'm preparing for a sermon. Your stuff is awesome. Can I use it?" So it's with his blessing that I'm using it this morning, but I do want to say these ideas are not my own because he looked at David a little differently than anyone else. He said that David did meet the qualifications, but instead of having height, instead of being tall and big and strong, David had God's own heart. And he reveals that in what he says. This is verse 47. He says, "All those gathered here will know that it is not by sword or spear that the Lord saves, for the battle is the Lord's, and he will give you all into our hands." You see, having the same heart as God is wanting the same things that God does. It's wanting the good things like love and truth and peace, and thinking about and doing those things. The Bible describes David as a man after God's own heart because he, one, knew what God desired, and two, desired those things for himself, and then three, went out and acted on those desires. And that's what he's doing by facing Goliath. And David, he wasn't even old enough to be a warrior. He didn't have fighting experience, but what he had experienced was God's deliverance. Here's his reply to Saul when Saul asks him basically the same question. "You're just a boy. You're not a warrior. You're not qualified. You can't fight Goliath." David says, verse 34, "Your servant has been keeping his father's sheep. When a lion or a bear came and carried off a sheep from the flock, I went after it, struck it, and rescued the sheep from its mouth. When it turned on me, I seized it by its hair, struck it, and killed it. Your servant has killed both the lion and the bear. This uncircumcised Philistine will be like one of them, because he has defied the armies of the living God. The Lord who rescued me from the paw of the lion and the paw of the bear will rescue me from the hand of this Philistine. So David says, if it's truly experience that matters, I have experience where it matters. I don't have experience fighting, but God has rescued me time and time again against every opponent that I've faced, and I am convinced that he can do that with Goliath. And that's what gave David the confidence to go out and face him. Instead of equipment, he tried on Saul's equipment that Saul gave him, but it didn't work for him. He wasn't used to it. Instead of sword and shield and armor, David had God fighting for him. Here's what he says to Goliath, verse 45. He says, "You come against me with sword and spear and javelin, but I come against you in the name of the Lord Almighty, the God of the armies of Israel, whom you have defied." I think we know the rest of the story. David slings a stone, knocks down Goliath, finishes him off. The Israelites win the battle. But it brings us back to the question, who was Israel's champion? It wasn't Eliab with his wicked heart and his judgment and criticizing of others that revealed that heart. It wasn't Saul who was trying to get someone else to do his job for him and revealed that he wasn't or didn't have the heart to be the true king of Israel. And even David wasn't Israel's true champion, though he represented him. Because really, God was Israel's true champion. He's the one that fought the battle, like we sung. The battle belongs to the Lord. He's the one that provided the strength. David couldn't and didn't take any credit for the victory. He gave all the glory to God. So as we conclude, I want to ask you guys, who are you more like in this story? Are you like Eliab, criticizing others? Are you like Saul, not trusting God to give you the strength to do what he's called you to do? Or you're like David, who knows that if we want the same things God wants, and we take those desires as our own and go and act on them, that God's will be done and we will see amazing victories.